educators, how good are you at paying attention to students' strengths versus their challenges? I'm also curious how good you are at noticing your own strengths versus your own challenges. Today, we have a very special video on the channel because we are going to be talking to the authors of this book, Hacking Deficit Thinking, 8 reframes that will change the way you think about strength-based practices and equity in schools. And then at the very end, my co-host Susannah and I are actually going to break down how you can infuse even more strength-based practices into your academic and one-to-one coaching with students. It's going to be a rich hour, so let's dig in. Well, yay, Byron, Kelsie, Susannah, I'm so glad we could all wrangle time zones to be here together today. Welcome.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having us. Great to be here, ready to have an awesome discussion.
Yeah, so I'm going to let you all quickly introduce yourselves. And we're here because we're discussing your book, Hacking Deficit Thinking, but maybe for those who don't know it, give just a quick synopsis of who you are and what brought you to this book. And also if there's anything about yourself, any identity markers that you feel might be important to name when we're talking about deficit thinking in schools. So feel free to add that. And maybe we'll start with Byron, then we'll hear from Kelsie, and then Susannah, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I am Byron McClure. I am many different things. Most recently, I am a Texan now. I was in the DMV and I just moved to Houston, Texas. So it still doesn't feel right. I wanted to practice saying I'm a Texan. I don't know. It doesn't feel right. I'm from the DMV. That's home for me. Been there most of my life. So my wife is from Houston, and so we moved down here a few months ago and getting settled. But aside from that, I am a national certified school psychologist. Practiced inside of the public school setting in the DMV for a little over a decade. I then went on to work in some really cool spaces, in particular redesigning a high school in Southeast DC. And then went on, I founded my own SEL company called Lessons for SEL. I had an exit event where I sold my company, and then my company was acquired and I merged with a larger SEL company called 7 Mindsets, where I am currently the director of innovation. But the reason why I'm here today to speak with you all is about something I'm super proud of, which is my first published book with my amazing co-author, Kelsie Reed. We just put out Hacking Deficit Thinking. So amongst all of those things, I am now a published author.
That's awesome. And by the way, I grew up in Houston. I'm a big fan of Houston. So
nice, awesome. I'm gonna share some footage on my social media. I got to go to some really cool places, and I went to the Breakfast Club for lunch. So that was pretty cool as well. So we'll have to trade some Houston restaurants a little later.
Awesome. Kelsie, who are you? Why are you here?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Kelsie Reed. I'm from the Midwest, so I identify as a Midwesterner. I'm born and raised in Michigan, went to school in grad school at Loyola University, Chicago, so lived there for a few years, moved out here right before out here. I say that as if you know, I'm in Maryland now. So which is really ironic actually, because I'm currently working in Prince George's County Public Schools, which is where Byron attended when he was younger. So a little like cross paths that we didn't even kind of realize happened. But yeah, so I've been practicing as a school psychologist. This is my 3rd year now. So I graduated in 2020. and did a lot of work in grad school on the school to prison pipeline, racial disparities in school discipline practices, kind of paved the way for my dissertation, which was on deficit thinking. So specifically looking at how teachers kind of think about students and how that can either contribute to or prevent higher rates of suspension usage in schools. So really, really passionate about this topic. And Byron and I, when we had the opportunity to write a book on it, I was obviously super excited to have kind of like this extension of a lot of the work that I was doing for my dissertation. So yeah, super excited to be here and excited about the book. And yeah, thank you for having us.
Susannah, you come to us from, since we're talking geographies right now, why don't you share where in the world you are?
Well, where I am is in Bermuda. However, I do identify as a Canadian. So I'm born and raised Canadian, and then I moved here to Bermuda about 12 years ago. And I've been in education for about 25 years, learning, a classroom teacher for many, many years, all different levels, preschool, middle school, college, all the way through. And then as now a learning specialist, I coach students as an executive function coach. And then recently I, along with my co-author, wrote the book Flexible Mindsets in Schools. And that's kind of now my new love and passion, and just helping to see where I can have some impact in building more flexible mindsets. And when I saw your book, it just, the overlap between them is just, there's so many pieces that I feel are interlinked and could really make such a big difference in our education system. So it got me really excited to want to talk to you and find out a little bit more.
Well, and in a moment, Susannah, I'll let you ask our first question to get us into the discussion, but just to round us out here for people who may be new to me, even though we're on my channel, I'm Gretchen Wegner, and I've created something called the Anti-Boring Approach to Powerful Studying. I'm an academic coach, and I also train educators in how to be academic coaches, but also how to have a more human-centered approach to teaching study skills and teaching teachers how to teach and learners how to learn all at the same time. So there's a lot that spoke to me about this book. So let's dive in.
Yes, let's do it. Let's do it.
And we're going to start with my full-blown confession. Because I live in Bermuda, I have read as much as I can about both of you in your book online. I have read as much of the look inside as I possibly can. And so I come to this conversation both with a little bit of knowledge and a lot of curiosity. So just self-disclosing that, the questions that I have are coming from the great interest I found in the beginning stages of looking into your work. So, what a great place to start. How about you just start with giving us the definition of deficit thinking? How would you describe that?
So what we did for the book is really cool, is we kind of made a shared definition based on what teachers, other professionals working in the schools, kind of how they defined it, and kind of compiled that together to create our definition that we used for the book of deficit thinking. I'm probably not going to quote it exactly because I can't remember off the top of my head, but how I would kind of define it is a distorted lens that kind of impacts the way we view the students that we work with. So it leads to a hyper focus on student weaknesses, student deficits, and we see this within ourselves too. So a hyper focus on our own weaknesses, our own deficits, which leads to, when we're talking specific to the school setting, us absolving responsibility for kind of, addressing those weaknesses, ensuring that students can reach their fullest potential, because we place a lot of blame on them. So we're blaming students and families for these problems, quote unquote, that we're seeing, and we're not taking the time to think about how we may be contributing, other systemic factors that are contributing, and ways that we can truly make a difference, because they do exist, but that deficit thinking kind of blinds us. Anything you want to add, Byron?
Yeah, I think you did a good job capturing it, Kelsie. And Kelsie and I were both psychologists, and we wanted to make sure that we brought in the perspective, the thinking of teachers, of instructional coaches, of special education teachers, of parents that went into, creating this definition of deficit thinking. And I think two things that Kelsie called out is, like, we call it a distorted lens. And for me, I don't have my shades with me now, but I'm getting into shades. And I have little ones. I have 3 kids, and they'll touch them, and their hands are always like grimy for some reason, and it's like fingerprints everywhere. Like if they eat waffles and there's syrup on it, it'll be like sticky on the glasses. And if you put those on, the way how you see the world around you is distorted. It's not clear. And similarly, in real life, whatever it is, if you have a distorted lens, you're not seeing the world clearly in front of you. And Kelsie, now we go on to say, and what these other educators were saying, deficit thinking is a way of seeing the world around you through this distorted lens. And it also comes into play where we have these faulty beliefs, this dirty, gringy way of viewing the world around us can really mess up our perception. It can mess up our interactions. It can make us not operate in our full potential. And then if we're not careful of addressing that, of clearing this lens, of shifting away from those things, if we're not careful, it'll also impact our students, our staff, our school communities. And we go a step further and say that this distorted lens is really no fault of me, of you, of any one teacher or educator. It's really systemic. We have to look at our graduate training and prep programs of giving us this distorted lens of ways how we view things and see things. And so in the book, we really set this definition as a tone as we build on that and go throughout the rest of our work.
Well, one of the things that was so exciting to me is, in such a short book, and it really is short, each chapter is so jam-packed with different structures that help us see deficit thinking from different perspectives. Whether it's what are they called? I'm not thinking that the 6 or 7
the 8 reframes.
No, not that the reframes were wonderful, but not even the reframes yet. It's so funny. I was talking to a friend who is a mom, a new mom, over the weekend, and I was telling her about this chapter because she needed it with her parents, but I can never remember the name. The distortions,
Cognitive
distortions.
Thank you, the cognitive
Yes.
distortions. There we are.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So like one chapter discussing some well-known cognitive distortions, those are actually written in my wallet as a personal growth thing. I've had them for years so that I can catch myself when I'm having those distortions, but you define them as deficit distortions, not just cognitive distortions. So we might get into that in a little bit, but just to give people listening the richness. So one chapter is about that, another chapter about the characteristics of white supremacy culture and how those characteristics contribute to that smudgy lens on the glasses, like extra smudges there. So just to say, I was really enlivened. I was going to say impressed, but that's the wrong word. I was enlivened, and Susannah knows I was reading it last week, and we had a really fun conversation together because there were so many lenses we could look at the idea of deficit thinking through. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I love that so much that it resonates with you, each of the different pieces, because we really were intentional about trying to touch every facet of the school community and how these different pieces contribute and ways that we can kind of change that. So thank you for recognizing that.
Well, and I think I have a question based on the definition, and then maybe Susannah, we can move into one of your other thoughts. But in the definitions you each gave, it sounded like deficit thinking is itself a distortion that doesn't necessarily rely on identity markers such as racism, classism, ability, disability. Like you can have deficit thinking And it doesn't necessarily have to be deficit thinking about a certain group of people. So it doesn't have to be that way, it sounds like, but they're very entangled. Is that true, or do you want to clarify if it seems like I have a distorted understanding?
No, I think the way how you're approaching it, I think you're on the right track. And, I'll use myself as an example. I identify as a Black male. Going through my graduate prep program as a school psychologist, ironically enough, I started on the clinical psychology track, where we were trained to identify the worst in people in mental illness. And then I switched to school psychology. But I was trained as a Black male on utilizing tools to view the worst in people, regardless of your race at the surface level. I finished my training, go into practicum, internship, and then I become a practitioner. As a Black man, it never set right with me. And so I had to do my own research and reflecting on what's the real basis of these tools. And I began to uncover, the origins of assessments like the Stanford Binet, looking at things like the CHC theory that were heavily rooted, not just in deficit ideology, but in eugenics as well, where, people wanted to prove that there were superior races and that there were inferior races of people. And they created these tools to help them do that. And, here I am, a Black male utilizing these tools, unbeknownst to me at the time. And so, I think where the deficit thinking showed up is just from a historical perspective that I never really tapped into, but there was something inside of my practice that just never set well with me. And so I had to be, just as a practitioner, I had to be very deliberate about seeking out the answers of why doesn't this feel right? Why am I in an IEP meeting telling a parent who looks just like me about her child who looks just like my kids, why their kid won't be successful? Why they're all of these things? I was practicing through a distorted lens. And so one of the things that Kelsie and I were hoping to do is to help people understand that we're not blaming any one person or groups of people, but we do have to be cognizant of the origins of, the work that we're engaging in, of the practices that we're taking part of, and how, if we're not careful, these systematic practices and policies can lead to, disproportionate outcomes and then further perpetuate deficit thinking and deficit ideology. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but I mean, we have to wrestle with those things. And as a Black male, that's something that I had to wrestle with as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that story, because I also, one of the hats I wear as a learning specialist is doing psychoeducational assessments with students. And it's always been one of the things that has bothered me. And as much as I want to help a student to identify their learning profile, I want them to identify their strengths. I want them to know where they, the things that are going to make a difference for them. And yet, as you're saying, the tools that I'm using to identify that is absolutely, there are so many biases, so much when I speak to parents and try to talk to them, because I am here in Bermuda in a different, our own education system, different cultural, some of the questions I'm asking them, I just have to confess to parents, like, this is just not okay. And it's the only tools that we have at this moment to, so much change needs to happen in that regard, especially around those right at the origin of the testing itself. No, I was just going to say that as you were speaking as well, one of the questions that I had was, again, from the quote in the beginning of the book, since I need to wait up to 3 weeks to get a book delivered. The Amazon doesn't deliver door to door in Bermuda. But one of the quotes in your introduction was, if my instruction benefits some students and not others, it has to be the student's fault. And I feel like this belief it's so prevalent amongst teachers and educators, and yet it is so destructive. To start from that place of putting that responsibility on students. And I just wondered if you could just say more about how we blame students and how we do that often to take the responsibility off ourselves. I mean, I think we've all been guilty of it at some point or another, but that awareness of how we do that, I'd just like to hear more from both of you on that topic.
And maybe a concrete example or two, because I'll say I noticed as I was reading, my mind would soften into not understanding or feeling confused at times. It was really interesting, not because anything was wrong with the words, but it's my own mind fighting the distortions that I have inherited. And your book has so many nice concrete details in it too. So I find those really grounding when my mind doesn't want to understand it.
Yeah, that's helpful feedback. I'm curious to hear more about that, but I'll kind of dive into this question first. I think so when we talk about blaming students, I think it's the easiest thing to do if you really think about it. So that quote, if my instruction benefits some students and not others, it has to be the student's fault. It's kind of going back to kind of what Gretchen mentioned earlier, the white supremacy culture chapter really focuses on how we operate in schools as if the teacher knows all. And so, we're the master of information. We are projecting and presenting and teaching, and we're teaching students, but that mentality of I know all and you know nothing is damaging, because it doesn't offer opportunities for us to reflect on maybe we should be changing some things. Maybe there's some things we could be doing differently. Maybe, this method, this approach doesn't work for this particular student. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with me or them. It just means we need to switch some things up. So I think, when we talk about blame, that's where the biggest piece of it is that it's easy. It's easy to blame. It's easy to say, oh, well, I tried this, I tried that. That student is struggling. That student can't learn, because then it takes the onus off of you to attempt more things, to do something differently. So I'm trying to think in terms of specific examples. I mean, I think that's the one that I see the most, maybe when it's students who have identified disabilities, or students with severe, quote unquote, behavioral challenges, kind of this whole idea of I've done all that I can do. And there's nothing more that can be done. And then that responsibility is completely taken off of you and completely put on the student, and it leads to those lowered expectations. So that's the most damaging piece, I think, of it, is that when we put that blame completely on students, take the responsibility of us, we have automatically kind of believed that this is the highest that student can reach. Like, this is the threshold. So I think there are a lot of pieces to that. Anything you want to add, Byron?
Yeah, I think a good illustration, and this example just popped in my head when I was working at the high school. It was a high needs area, inner city area. And when I first started working there, I started in the summer. I was a 12-month employee. And so I think I'm coming in, getting a head start, wanting to, learn my potential caseload, learn the staff. And so I'm meeting with the special education director at the time, and we're reviewing current students and incoming students. And I'm like, all right, I want to work with, students who have been having a difficult time. Like, I wanted to do some of the cool things that I did in my previous district. And I remember the conversation went to, okay, our 9th grade boys who have been identified with emotional disabilities never promote to the next grade. And I was like, so you mean they're not graduating? Like, what are we talking about here? And she's like, no, if you're a 9th grade boy with an emotional disability, you are not going to the 10th grade. I was like, how is this okay? And so, this, what Kelsie called this, I think, is a culture of low expectations. That became the expectation. If you're a 9th grade boy, if you have a emotional disability, and you're at this school, you're not going to go to the 10th grade. So what that means is when you start acting out, all right, we're just creating a list of things so that when you drop out or when you get arrested or, when something happens, it's just going to feel this expectation to have. And it's like, hold on, wait, no, like this is okay. Like one, this shouldn't be like a routine practice where no ninth grade boy promotes to the next grade. Like that is just so mind blowing to me, to where this expectation was acceptable. And so how are we examining what are we doing in this particular program? What are we doing as far as our placement? What are their IEPs? What are the supports? What is here? Like whatever had been done isn't working. And if we're not careful, not only is it easy to blame the students, it's easy to blame the staff when our students don't perform, which can also perpetuate the cycle of toxicity inside of a learning environment as well, to where now your educators are saying, well, I don't have the resources, I don't have the task, and I'm expected to do this. I have all of these demands, and then teachers leave. And so it's the cycle. And one of the things that Kelsie and I, like we also call out is like, we can't place the blame. We can't place this culture of low expectations on students, on the school community, on our staff. We got to start addressing some of these root causes. Why is it that systemically we have failed certain groups of kids or certain teachers and not equipped them with the resources, the tools, the trainings that they need to be successful? So if we're not careful, we can create those conditions where that just becomes the norm. And that's the way of school happens. But we have to unlearn those things and hack deficit thinking, which is why we're here.
Well, and we don't, many teachers, I think, would say they're not purposefully targeting these groups of students to try and have them be less successful. And nonetheless, we all are responsible in interrogating our own behaviors. There was a wonderful example early on, I think, in your book, with a teacher who purposefully partnered even with the students and asked some colleagues to come in and watch her too, to better understand that actually her behaviors were very racialized and she had no idea. And what was exciting to me about this example is she told the students she was doing this research, because the students had been, as students do, saying to her, like, man, you don't treat the Black girls the same way you treat the white girls. And she's like, oh, no, that can't be the case. And I'm pretty sure this was a white teacher. I don't remember now. But it was super cool to watch how she was willing to be curious, and to be curious alongside the students, and to say, hey, we're going to collect this data, let's see. And then they analyzed the data together, and sure enough, it showed that her behaviors were targeting one group more than another group. And how beautiful to let the students see that they could actually advocate for themselves and make some change.
Yeah, that's important. And I'm happy we're having this discussion, because you started out talking about like this level of curiosity. And I think if we can approach the work with the level of curiosity, it pushes us to be continuous learners, in the sense that I might not get it right, I might not understand, but I'm going into it with a flexible mindset. See what I did there? That can help us to continue growing, and it doesn't place the blame on people. And if we're not careful in these conversations, it can go to, well, you're just blaming me as a white woman, or you're just blaming me as a male in this education space, instead of saying, how have I contributed or not contributed, or what resources do I lack? What training do I need? And approaching it from a strength-based approach, which is some of the things that we're really calling for in this book. So, these conversations are important, and approaching it from that curious standpoint, there's value in that.
Go ahead, Susannah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, because I think it ties in really nicely with one of the other thoughts that I had, just in a real connection between our books around reflection, because we definitely, that curiosity is what we should always use to guide us and get into it. And then once we start getting into that deep self-reflection, and you mentioned this in the intro of your book as well, just how uncomfortable that kind of deep reflection can be, and how we have to be willing and open up ourselves to facing contradictory evidence that, it's not going to be comfortable to look at and to explore. And it's hard. Reflection is hard work. And yet, as you point out, and as in Flexible Mindsets, we would agree, that is one of the best tools we have, is our own ability to self-reflect. What ways do you recommend that teachers do this, such hard and thoughtful work? What are some of the suggestions you would have?
I think the biggest piece is first, at the base level, making sure that our education spaces are ready for these conversations. So I think oftentimes schools try to dive in with their equity work and their self-reflection work, but they haven't taken the time to develop those meaningful relationships, make sure that it's a safe space. We're talking really being able to self-reflect and self-correct without being reprimanded. And so I think that is a huge challenge that I see personally, just kind of like in the practical sense. Like, I know a lot of my schools, the staff, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of creating and cultivating a safe space for us in order to do that. But kind of, once we get to that space, I think, just like you said, it's really about that self-reflection and self-correction in a way that leads to growth. So we're not thinking about things in terms of, I caused this big, huge issue because I was thinking in this way. It's more, okay, I'm able and willing to acknowledge, that this was a faulty way of thinking. And I see the impact that it's had, because like you said, we can collect data. There's so many ways that we can objectively identify the ways that deficit thinking has occurred in our classes and in our schools. But from there, we have to step away from that, or we step into that discomfort. We need to step into that discomfort and use that to address it, to tackle it. So I think, and it's uncomfortable for me too. I think I've been in spaces where I look back on something that I've done or said, and it's like, ooh, like that probably wasn't the best, way of viewing that situation, way of supporting that student or that teacher. And you have to acknowledge that that's part of the process. Like, nobody's perfect, and we are all kind of working through this together. So I think kind of finding your people is a big one for me, finding those people who are on the same page as you, willing to kind of talk through things in this way, is a good starting point, especially when you're in a space where maybe it's kind of, you're having that challenging piece of the school culture, maybe not being as receptive, as a whole. Yeah.
Well,
And I'll just quickly add to that too, for the reflection piece. Kelsie and I were psychologists. And so again, in this book, it was important for us to get the voices of teachers, of other educators, curriculum, instructional specialists, like people who are like way smarter than us in these areas. Kelsie is like one of the smartest people you'll ever meet. So I'll say smarter than me. And one of the people who we interviewed was Dr. Tim Runge. And Dr. Runge is the man. So he is a professor at IUP, which is where I got my doctorate degree. And he does a lot of consulting with this organization called PTAN. It's the Pennsylvania Technical Institute. I don't know, Google it. It's called PTAN, PATTAN. But one of the things that Dr. Runge talks about is reflection. And we actually did a podcast episode with them. And I think we might have covered some things in our book, but if not, in that podcast episode, which I think I need to release, by the way, he goes into some amazing detail about this process, this protocol that he uses to help people who he works with in a consultative model to reflect. And he can tell you way better than I can. So I'll make sure that I get that episode out. I might release it just as a YouTube thing, or even share some of the notes with you all. But he has some awesome work around reflection that I think your listeners might be interested in.
Say the name of your podcast so people listening can look it up.
So the name of the podcast is called the Healing Centered Conversations Podcast. And it's on wherever you listen to the podcast. Also, we have a YouTube channel. And one of the cool things that Kelsie and I did is we interview people to get their voices using the medium of the podcast. And so we interview Dr. Brandon Gamble, who's mentioned in our book, who's a brilliant psychologist. He did some really cool work around like the cognitive assessments in the state of California. Like he's like the go-to expert on that. We interviewed Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims, who's another really awesome. She's a school psychologist of the year. She's doing awesome work out of Pennsylvania. We interviewed several other people to get their voices and put them up on the podcast. So it's called the Healing Centered Conversations Podcast.
Well, and one thing I want to name, since we've had such a teacher-focused conversation, and I know a lot of people in my world are either leaving schools and coming into academic coaching, or just are academic coaches. And I think it's a very powerful practice to use the word interrogate again. It seems so mean, and I know we mean a much more loving thing than the word interrogate, so I need to find a better word. But to take a look at where we might be caught in deficit thinking, and even coaches. So we do a lot of work with parents and teachers. Like we have access to teachers simply by the kinds of language that teachers email students, or the kinds of grades that we see in the online portals. But I think coaches really find, because parents are really caught in deficit thinking, because the whole model of schooling is so focused on grades, and you need to be here in order to do good. And if you're not there, then something's wrong with you. And parents, I think, they see their kids' strengths, but they don't see those strengths reflected in the schools. And we coaches are in the middle of that. And I think we try to keep our focus on the student, like back off all you other voices. But I think it can be really hard and really sneaky, the different ways that deficit thinking can creep in. And I loved your chart that you had of reframing different adjectives that we use about students. And I'm going to look up that page right now so I can show it to the video, but I don't know if either of you, or Susannah, you haven't seen the chart, but it might be fun to name some adjectives that educators or parents say about students, and then talk about the reframes of them.
I got it. I'm going to pull something up.
I'm just cheesing. You're naming the things. You and Kelsie are synced. Like the things that you're naming are the things Kelsie, which one of the reasons why I wanted Kelsie to be a co-author. Like she knows her stuff. And like those are things that Kelsie directly contributed to. Yeah.
No, you're naming all of mine.
I just love a good chart. And part of what I do as an academic coach is teach students how to take their notes and turn them into their own chart so that they're making things their own. So I love a good chart. I think you can share your screen if you want to, Kelsie, if you have.
Perfect. I thought I had, here it is. The PDF of the book is right here. So let me just.
And while you're looking for that, by the way, there was another chart that I really liked of famous people who had learning disabilities or autism or ADHD or intellectual disabilities or emotional disabilities. And I wanted to say I was very interested to see Jerry Seinfeld under autism, though I do wonder if he actually, I Googled it, and I don't know if he actually says that he's on the spectrum, but as soon as I saw that, it made so much sense to me how he is in interviews. And anyway.
Yes. I think that's just another example. I know I just pulled this up, but it's another example of the fact that when we hear, let me do this. When we hear, autism or anxiety, we create a whole picture of who this person is based on that, that identification, that label, and we're not seeing the whole person. So it's like, well, how could he have autism. He's so funny. He's so this. And it's like, what, what are we thinking there? Where did our mind go when we heard that word? So, okay. Yes. So I do have this. So yes, I do. I love this chart. I think it's so easy to do this, to use this. I think the one that I have been doing a lot this year actually is this tattletale justice oriented one. There are so many teachers, like, well, that student is constantly, tattletaling on, I'm like, well, maybe they're seeking justice. They see something that they perceive to be, unjust, that they don't agree with, and they're seeking, why would we diminish that skill? Like, that's a strength for a student to be able to identify something doesn't sit right or feel right with them. So I think you can do that with any of these.
Well, and a word that has come up in my consulting at this particular school that I'm at, and I heard this over and over again, both from students and from teachers, and these are young adults in my context, so not elementary age, but was the word introvert. Oh, they're an introvert, as if they don't belong here somehow, or school's not, if they're an introvert, so they're not taking advantage of all of the different kinds of learning we're offering. And I did wonder, and I'm starting to track if the folks who are being called introverts are also students of color, because I think they might be, and I think they might not actually feel safe bringing their full selves and their full identities to the picture. And that word introvert is a code. People aren't wanting to say anything negative about the student. So they're saying something that's supposedly positive, but they're using it in this deficit way.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that once again goes back to, not making assumptions about students, seeking to find the root cause, speaking with your students about what it is that they're feeling, because you're right. I mean, that could go multiple ways depending on how you interpret that, which is a big contributor to deficit thinking when we're in those ambiguity. We have those areas of ambiguity.
And what I like about that list is, Kelsie, if you could bring it up for like one quick second, is if we're not careful, our students, our children, the people that we work with, ourselves, we can live our life as if we are those things and then live up to these expectations. So like I was always, if I'm looking over here on the left column, like talkative as a child. Like my parents to this day will call me stubborn, all of these things. But in some of the later chapters, we talk about taking strength-based assessments, and to where on the negative side, I see stubborn. On the right-hand side, I see persistent, which taking my the Clifton Strength Finders, one of my top strengths is achiever. And so like, I am going to work towards something and be persistent. What if people poured into me, and instead of saying you're stubborn or you're bullheaded? Yes. People could have poured into me with the one being talkative, or really people call me a lot of these hyper for sure, energetic. I could really hone those things to where now I'm using a lot of those skills in my work professionally. And what if we poured into people, I'm gonna call this right side, we're calling it the positive adjective, but the potential adjectives of what our young people can potentially become, or what we can become ourselves, instead of being hyper focused on this negative adjective side, and people then living up to those expectations.
Yeah, I just think the power of language, that we can really, this to me is one of those things that we could do tomorrow. Well, now this moment is to think about the words we're using and our choice of language, and not only how we speak, and also on report cards. Like if I look at that list and I think of how many students' report cards I've read, like, can we just edit our written words as well? Like take one step towards just thinking about those words and the difference between an attention seeker and a connection seeker. Like that's night and day if you see yourself as seeking connection versus attention. Like some of those could just make such a big difference to students and how they view themselves and their identities.
And I think about that introvert is, what if they're being self-protective? that's a beautiful thing to be as a student. My little timer went off. I had set it quietly for 35 minutes because I knew we'd be off and running. But there's one topic I really want to make sure that we cover, because I know there are teachers out there who have the thought I'm about to share. And I know it because it's happening at the school that I'm consulting at. And it's like, we have high expectations. Don't tell us that our expectations are too low. The students are not rising to our expectations. And so that just one example, there is one particular thing that needs to be tested in this environment that has been created to be a pretty high stakes test, where in the midst of a quarter, students have only 2 opportunities to be tested. And if they fail one, then they have to pass the other one. And it creates so much anxiety for the students. And I think the teachers would say, look at us, our expectations are so high. We're training them for a certain context. And if they can't meet it in the assessment, then that's not our problem. That's the student's problem. And so I'd love for us to just talk a little bit about where is deficit thinking there, because I don't think it's fully apparent to the general eye.
I have a lot of thoughts. I'll get us started. I see Byron, I think, has some thoughts too. I think the issue with that statement, that belief, is, first of all, that our high expectation is reliant on one measure that doesn't necessarily allow students to actually demonstrate. I mean, let me back up. I just have issues with standardized testing in general. I think a lot of teachers do, a lot of us do. So I don't think this is a controversial topic, hopefully. But
I will say this isn't a standardized test. It's just a high stakes test.
Okay. Good to know.
I also have issues with standardized tests. Students have to demonstrate a certain procedure. And if they can't demonstrate that procedure, they fail.
Okay. So the other issue is when we're talking high expectations without accountability. So this whole mindset of, well, if they fail, then it's on them, is kind of where the issue is, because what we should have is a system where if they quote unquote fail, or they quote unquote struggle, it presents me with an opportunity to identify, what else do I need to support them? That's high expectations, is recognizing that, there's something that is lacking. There's something missing here. I need to figure out how we can together kind of fill that gap, rather than this whole, I have high expectations of you without me doing anything to kind of like to contribute to that. You know what I mean? That's not necessarily high expectations. I think we need to rethink what that means in our schools more than anything. That's kind of where I initially went, but I have more thoughts, but I want to hear Byron says first.
Yeah, I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I legit was about to tweet out earlier today, and then I was doing 1,000 different things. But about this concept, like, we have to have a conversation about high expectations versus low expectations. And then on my drive, I was going to downtown Houston. I was like, I want to do a podcast about this, or maybe it's a YouTube interview. So I'm happy we're getting started with this conversation. Okay, so I have 2 different thoughts on it. The first thought is just based off of my experiences. And my experiences, I've always worked, with a certain demographic, and that demographic being high needs, high poverty, low SES, free and reduced, at all of those things, right? And so,
just to say SES, socioeconomic status, I'm assuming.
Yes, absolutely. And so students who frequently live in high poverty areas. And so in those communities, I typically would see a culture of low expectations, where in the example I gave earlier, these are those 9th grade boys with emotional disabilities, like, they're not going to be successful. So when they are distracted or cussing somebody out, they're just living up to this low expectations. And so I don't do anything. I just let them do it. I let them skip class because they're not going to be successful anyway. So who cares if you come to class? Or I'm not going to give you your accommodations because I know your parents aren't going to come to this meeting. Who cares? It's literally this culture of low expectations, which is a major problem. And it's an issue. It's like, no, you're going to come into this class, you're going to sit down, you're going to get this education. And that's the expectation. And so, one, if we're not careful, that culture of low expectations is crippling. We're not talking about that enough. There's this other angle. And Kelsie, it was from a conversation that we were part of earlier this morning, to where it's a high performing, high achieving schools, where you mentioned the word high stakes, and it's another demographic. And it's, well, we have admissions tests. So if you come here, we have expectations that are through the roof. And if you can't meet these expectations, like, what are you doing here? Like, and so there's another twist to it where it's also nuance. And, I think we have to be able to have a conversation about both of those things then in the school, to where you have high stakes. And I want to be clear about the high stakes component. If you're in a graduate prep program, like Kelsie and I were psychologists, we both, Kelsie, tell me if it's true for y'all, but we had the fatal flaw in our cognitive assessment class. Y'all didn't have this? And so
Midwest, we didn't do a lot of cognitive in my program, which I'm grateful for.
Nice. And so again, I was trained in this deficit model, but if you got 2 errors as you were administering, the cognitive assessment, like, you fail out the program. A fatal flaw. Like, the first time we'll work with you, we'll get you some reflection that you need, we'll remediate it, and you got a second chance. You mess up, it's a wrap. In a medical profession, if let's say you're wanting to become a surgeon, my god sister, who's from Detroit, she's a breast surgeon. And so they have high stakes to where people's lives are there. And so we have to approach it from a very nuanced perspective, not just this is the way how it has to be and being rigid. Whether you're working with students from backgrounds where there's high or low SES or high SES, or you're working with graduate students who are wanting to become psychologists, or you're working in a medical profession where people are training to become surgeons, we have to be able to have nuanced conversations about these different things. But to sum this up, if we're not careful, if you have a culture of low expectations, it can be damaging. If you have a culture of high expectations and it can be damaging and harmful across both paths. So, I wish we could dive deeper into this conversation, because it's something that we have to discuss. And with our book, Hacking Deficit Thinking, we were hoping to get these type of conversations started so we can dive deep and really start changing and moving the needle on some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And it just made me this may seem not connected, but it made me think I make chocolate. I love making chocolate. It's one of my hobbies. And I was watching this show, and I'm not getting the name of it, a chocolatier anyway, a world-renowned chocolatier from France on Netflix. His show, it's competitive. It's a competition about making chocolate. And when I watched it, it's the best competition show I've ever watched, because the 2 lowest people, so everybody makes their chocolate thing that they have to make, whatever, and the 2 lowest people, they don't get to compete in the next competition. They get to go spend time with the chocolatier, learning from the expert. The other students don't get that. The ones that did okay with it, they're doing okay. They don't need the time with them. They give it to the 2 lowest people. I'm like, if I was on this competition show, I think I would just, do whatever I could to get more time with him. And the way it was set up, it was so not competitive, because it was this growth mindset of a culture where we're here to support the people who need us most to learn. We're not here. Yes, we're going to have high expectations, but if we recognize there's something you're not able to do, we're here to help you learn. We're not here to call you out on what you're not able to do. I just thought it was a great example of how schools could be.
I love that so much. And I think, going back to that example, if we were to use the testing, all of these measures, I think there are so many other ways that we can use our data. And instead, we're using them to inform, how much funding we get, whether that teacher is a good teacher. But why aren't we using it, like you said, to identify, who needs a bit more of whatever, rather than kind of punishing students, blaming students for things that, that they're struggling with. So I like that a lot. And I wish I hope we can get to a place like that in our schools.
Or using those same tools in the chocolatier. Is that how you say that?
Yeah.
That's a cool word. That's fun to say, a chocolatier. In that example, like what if we're using, these mechanisms to those two lowest people? What if there were tools that were set up to keep those two low people out from even having an opportunity to appear? And like that's where, we gotta have a conversation about that. Like how have tools or resources or practices or policies been used to keep access, to keep opportunities, to deny certain people from even having some of those shots and opportunities? And so like those are some of the systemic things that we need to address as well. But it's a conversation that we gotta have, and we have to approach it from this nuanced approach.
I think the last thing I want to say here is a quote that I wrote on my little piece of paper that I was taking notes on, from you all, which is simply deficit thinking fuels academic anxiety. And whether it's from the low expectations or the high expectations, it feels like in that Venn diagram, there's anxiety. And I think anxiety is not looked at directly enough as it's seen as a student's problem and not as the educator's, I don't even want to say problem, but if there is a lot of anxiety in an academic environment, let's look at what we can do about that, because it doesn't have to be that way, and learning doesn't have to be anxiety fueled. Well, I knew we were going to have a fun time, and we did. So everybody, I highly recommend it. One thing we didn't mention that I will mention now is each chapter has a what you can do now section to it, as well as a long-term like what you can do in the long term. And that piece spoke to me so much because I specialize in the least students need to know in order to get the results that they want to get. And I feel like that's exactly how this book was structured, as the least you need to know to start hacking your own deficit thinking now. So thank you both for that so much.
That's going to be the new title of our second edition, The Least You Need to Know.
Not if I take it first. Not if I take it first.
That's great.
Thank you all, everyone, for hanging in to the end of that incredible interview with the authors of Hacking Deficit Thinking. In just a moment, Susannah and I are going to add a few ideas for how academic coaches can pay attention to how we hack deficit thinking in our one-to-one coaching practices. But first, I just want to invite folks, if you appreciated this video, to like it, to subscribe to my channel, to comment below if you have a thought or a question about how deficit thinking shows up in your own teaching or coaching practices. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. So Susannah, we've got a few tips that we talked about after that. What's the first one you would say to academic coaches?
So I think one of the things that I notice most often in my own language is just how when I'm talking about students, noticing the words I'm using when I'm describing them, like in a conversation with a parent, or if I was doing an email to a teacher or a parent, noticing how I'm describing the students' behaviors, how I'm describing what they are doing, and making sure that I'm like that adjective chart, just checking my own language and making sure that I'm being as strength-based and noticing what's working as much as I can.
Yeah, and what occurs to me is there are two words, how I say, don't use the word study and don't use the word review. There are two words that I think I would like to encourage academic coaches not to use in our notes, and to reframe if we see these words come up in parent or teacher communications. And those two words are unmotivated and resistant. I don't think those are helpful words. They describe more of the wall that we're feeling, but they don't actually, when I say the wall from the student, but they don't actually describe what might be going on with the student from a strength-based perspective. And so actually, let me ask you quickly, this is off the cuff, but what do you think are potential words we could replace unmotivated and resistant with?
So definitely, if we're thinking about, I notice when I'm talking about students who, or thinking about students being unmotivated, thinking about what's the one layer deeper than that. So if they're presenting as unmotivating, I notice that they're really tired lately. I notice that they come to sessions and they're not feeling as excited about what we're doing together. And looking at, there's something under what the motivation that is where we should be looking at. Why is this student struggling, as opposed to labeling it as unmotivated?
Yeah. Yeah. And what I love that you just did there in our tips here. So our first tip was notice, notice how we are framing students' behaviors and attitudes. And then the next one is help reframe in our communications with parents and teachers. Often I see those words used by parents and teachers. And so when they are used, maybe acknowledging like, yeah, I know it seems that so-and-so is unmotivated. Or they may be presenting with behaviors that we judge as unmotivated. And here's what I think is really going on under the surface, or have we asked the student or whatever to try and get.
Yeah, just I'm wondering if maybe this might be going on for the student. And be be more of a detective about what's going on underneath those presenting behaviors.
Yeah, and just as an example, an unmotivated student may be still searching for their passion. Of course, I can already hear what parents and teachers and other coaches might say in response to that about that being not true. But anyway, we're building.
Not the point.
Yes, we're building our muscles in hacking deficit thinking and reframing it into strength-based words. So then that would be just tip number 3 is with students themselves. Having more strengths-based conversations or catching yourself if you're too focusing on weakness or correcting challenges. I mean, we are there to do that, but we also can have a strength-based perspective. One of the ways that I would do this when I was coaching is I would try and be neutral. Did you get your grade back yet? And no matter what the answer was, yeah, I got an A, or yeah, I got a C or a D. No matter what it was, I would stay neutral. Oh, you got an A. Tell me how you got that A. Oh, you got a C or a D. Tell me what contributed to getting the C or the D. So either way, I was curious and to pull out the strengths from the process. And maybe there were even strengths. I'm noticing, here's deficit thinking. I'm noticing that I was assuming an A means that they have strengths and a C or D means that they have challenges or weaknesses that need to be corrected. But there could also be strengths in this one area. There could also be challenges in the getting of the A. Let's not assume that grades equal strengths versus weaknesses.
Nice catch, Gretchen. Nice catch. Yes. Yeah, I think, and that's the pitfall I fall into, I think, as a coach, is that it's my job to help a student learn and grow. So I'm always looking for where's the learning, where's this edge that I want to help a student to grow. And so sometimes when I'm going over feedback with students, I can get way too focused on here's the thing you missed, or here's the thing you could have said differently, and not starting certainly with the things that are really they've done well, and even just highlighting for them all the pieces that they can, feel confident about and can enjoy and appreciate in what they're doing. Like you say, no matter what the grade is, it doesn't matter. There's going to be strengths in anything they do. So just making sure that that's way more important to the student, even though to me, it's more important that we identify the pieces that they can learn from.
Gosh, it's tricky. Talk to us about that 4th one.
Oh, my favorite, centering student consent. And we say it and we're like, oh yes, well, I will always ask a student first if they want to learn something. And that's great. And I wonder how many other ways we can challenge ourselves to really think of a student first as a person, and what they want and what's important to them is where we focus our attention. Yes, asking them, highlighting as much as we can what is important to them, and really making sure that we're partners with them in this journey through coaching, but really it's about them. And there's going to be opportunities in every session we have to introduce more and more consent and give them more and more choice and voice in what we're doing.
Awesome. And if you want to hear my little structure that I have, I say little because it's very simple for how to build consent into all kinds of conversations with students, you can go to gretchenwegner.com/consent and have a little downloadable 2-page printable. It really will change your coaching practice if you go get that. And if you go practice putting it in. I mean, I feel like it changed your practice.
100%. Yeah. Made
Awesome.
me such a better coach.
Mhm. She was already pretty good because she has a lot of strengths, and then she got even better with the consent burger.
I see what you're doing.
Okay, everyone, thanks for hanging out so long on this video. We hope that you've gotten a few great takeaways that you can take into your world with students and start finding even more strengths and naming them out loud. And we'll see you in the next video. Bye.